Does the title I chose for this latest episode of mine, The Holy Land and Us, Our Untold Stories, remind you of any documentary you might have watched on the telly recently? Well, some of you might perhaps have done so, but I'd bet that many more of you did not. So let me go back 18 months to the start of this story and reel off some facts that would introduce you to the two episodes broadcast on BBC Two earlier this month. And by the way, both episodes are now available on BBC iPlayer. I'll put the link in the description box. During the height of the COVID pandemic, a friend of mine approached me and said that the BBC was considering doing a documentary on Israel and Palestine that explored the problems challenging both peoples today and how the roots of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict could be traced to at least 1948. So they were seeking suggestions for two main figures to represent both the Jewish and Palestinian narratives. In fact, I came to understand that the Jewish character had already been selected, but not the Palestinian one. Having worked on this conflict for many long years, I had a few names that I shared with my friend, who in turn conveyed them to the BBC. My aim was to suggest two characters who are both reasonably well known and also strong enough in order to avoid any asymmetry or imbalance in either version of history. As it turned out, my suggestion, or suggestions in the plural, if you will, were dismissed, and the BBC chose Rob Reinder and Sarah Agha, a man and a woman I hadn't met personally, although I knew a fair bit about them both from different friends. And theirs is the documentary I watched over 2 weeks in 2 episodes. Rob and Sarah, along with their kith and kin, vocalizing their narratives, the untold stories of the Holy Land, to us, the viewers. And so how did I react to the 2 episodes? Well, if you read the introduction by the Beeb, the documentary was described as personal, profound, and deeply moving. Well, personal it certainly was, in that the two key characters expressed their viewpoints either directly or via their relatives or friends. Moreover, it was unexpectedly more profound than I'd thought, because the Beeb had agreed to include what I would call material supporting the Palestinian cause, which I'd really thought they would edit out for fear of offending or upsetting our own government or their Jewish friends. And finally, it was moving. When coming face to face with stories, relatives, and sites that they'd never, presumably, seen before. Mind you, there were also a few tears and hugs that were frankly over the top and that tried to evoke, or should that be invoke, overwhelming emotions in us viewers. So in short, I thank the BBC for this valiant attempt, and I also thank the main characters. I particularly thank Sarah Agha because she was facing a Rob Reinder who is on our screens a lot and perhaps has an easier or more familiar rapport with the viewers. But both sides separately defended their narratives with human strength, compassion, resoluteness, and conviction. But, and here comes my but, it's a big but. When the BBC described this documentary as personal, profound, and deeply moving, it should have also added unbalanced. Let me explain what I mean when I speak here of why I describe it as skewed before you get too impatient with me. Sarah's narrative was that a people were violently forced out of their homes and lands. After all, over 700,000 of them actually became refugees and lost their status, their statehood, their properties, and their belongings. But why were they forced out? Because another people, with British connivance, alas, that went back to the early 1900s, were allowed to come and inhabit this peopled land. Conversely, Rob's narrative was that the Jewish people had faced so many tragedies, culminating in the horrors of the Holocaust, that they were happy to find this land where they could flourish again, and that once in the country, they defended it ferociously against the Arabs who tried to kick them out or who refused to recognize their right to a state. There was, in fact, a scene or a photo of a brave young Jew from the UK who had ended up in Palestine via the horrible concentration camps. And there he was in the Negev, fending off the Jordanian army with his rifle. A bit stereotypical, I thought here, but never mind. So whilst I commend the overall effort of the BBC, here is my beef with the Jewish narrative led by Rob and his guests. The land was peopled already, with a very clear majority of Palestinians and a clear minority of Jews. They worked, farmed, and lived peacefully together in a neighborly frame of mind until the Jews, with British apathy, to put it mildly, decided to upset this equation, occupy the land, declare independence, and kick its original inhabitants, who had Palestinian documents like passports, currency, and property leases, out. This land, their land, was no longer theirs. And so the two narratives for me remain uneven. This was the Nakba, the catastrophe as Palestinians and other Arabs refer to it. So just imagine for a minute, you are homeless or persecuted. So you come to my home, have it partitioned into two, one part for me and the other part for you. And in so doing, kick me threateningly out of part of my own property, and then thank everyone for this home that provided you with a roof over your head. Now apply this to the whole populace. What about the original homeowners from Deir Yassin and all the unrecognized villages of 1948 all the way to 2023, this year, that have been razed, demolished, or taken over? The settlements and outposts that are being built everywhere in East Arab Jerusalem and the West Bank today on occupied Palestinian lands are illegal according to international law. And what happened in 1948 is, alas, happening now with the rest of historical Palestine. Israeli governments and their rabid settler supporters are doing their utmost to expunge Palestinians and Palestinian identity from the rest of Palestine. And the West, us, are coming up with tremulous objections and even some support by a few former colonial powers. It is this continuity in colonialism that was also missed out in the documentary. A second Nakba is taking place on Palestinian lands as I record this episode. A vile dispossession in Masafer Yatta, in Silwan, in Khan al-Ahmar, in Sheikh Jarrah, in the Old City, in Turmus Aya, across all parts of occupied Palestinian territories. And that is being overlooked by the West, just as it was somewhat overlooked by this documentary. So this is where I put my butt. This is where the narrative collapses for me, whether you conjugate this narrative in the past or in the present. And a few emotional hugs or tears will not right a historical and legal wrong, the disposition of a people that amounts to dispossession. I realize that many people now will object to my point of contention. Some of them will be annoyed. But obscuring the truth in a populist frenzy does not make it untrue. So, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Rob. And thank you, BBC. But I know from my own family, who used to live in Talbiye and in the German colony, as to who is right and who is wrong in this colonial enterprise. It is not an equal equation, but a predatory one, a move by one people against another. And that is where this attempt at symmetry falls apart. I feel for the Jews seeking a home. After all, I'm Armenian, and my own grandparents suffered a genocide in 1915, not different from the Jewish Holocaust in some sense, fled the Ottoman lands and sought refuge in Arab and Muslim lands like Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, Palestine, and Egypt. But they did not take over these countries and throw many of the original indigenous inhabitants out. Similarly, for Jews, I don't agree with them taking my home and then calling me the stranger in my own land. Enough said on this documentary. So let me conclude by using a Latin expression that we public international lawyers use too. Palestine was not a terra nullius. Palestine was not a nobody's land that could justify its occupation. I leave the rest for your own evaluation.